Welcome. We are jumping right into an exploration of a story that is, well, it's just notorious and absolutely pivotal in modern American history.
It really is.
We're going back to 1977. The place is Indianapolis, Indiana, and the event is the remarkable, terrifying, and ultimately transformative 63-hour standoff with a man named Anthony George Kiritsis.
And it's such a defining moment. I mean, what started out as a seemingly mundane financial dispute, a real estate problem.
Something that happens every day.
Exactly. It escalated into this national crisis that remarkably ended up fundamentally altering state laws all across the country, specifically laws regarding the insanity defense.
And that's really the core of what we're looking at today. We have this robust stack of sources that detail Kiritsis' life, the specifics of his shocking crime, which involved one of the most uniquely threatening weapons I think I've ever heard of.
Oh, absolutely.
And then, of course, the controversial trial and the huge ripples of legal and cultural change that followed.
The idea here is to be comprehensive. We want to understand how this one intense event, centered on one man's personal desperation, his paranoia, became a blueprint for documenting high-stakes crime. And, critically, how it forced this necessary legal reform.
We want to show you exactly how the actions of one man, a man driven right to the edge, changed the way American law thinks about mental illness and criminal responsibility.
It's a collision of so many things.
So let's quickly set the main stage. Let's introduce the key players before we get into the financial issue that started it all.
Okay, so the man at the center of it was Anthony George Kiritsis. He was born in 1932. The man he held hostage was Richard O. Hall, a mortgage broker.
And the incident itself, the sources pinned the start to Tuesday, February 8th, 1977.
That's right. It lasted for 63 harrowing hours. It just consumed the nation's attention, and a big part of that was because of how accessible Kiritsis made himself to the public.
And that's what's genuinely fascinating, from a historical standpoint, just recognizing how the fallout of this one incident shaped both the legal system, specifically that burden of proof in court, and also the way crime was documented. That instantaneous real-time documentation by what was then an emerging 24-hour media environment.
It's a classic example. You have jurisprudence, high-stakes drama, and broadcast journalism all colliding. Not slowly, but violently and immediately.
Okay, let's unpack this financial origin, because understanding the perceived injustice here is absolutely key to understanding the violence that came next.
It is.
Kiritsis was a resident of Indianapolis, and he was struggling. He had fallen pretty significantly behind on his mortgage payments for a piece of real estate he owned.
And you have to remember, we're talking about real estate in the mid-1970s. It's a time of economic flux. For Kiritsis, this wasn't some abstract contractual conflict. It became deeply, deeply personal.
And the catalyst, the thing that lit the fuse, was direct and immediate.
It was. The mortgage broker, Richard O. Hall, he just refused to grant Kiritsis any additional time to pay what he owed. He was initiating foreclosure, seizure procedures.
And Kiritsis didn't just interpret this as bad luck or a business deal gone wrong. He very quickly developed this very specific and highly dangerous motivation that was rooted in this feeling of being deliberately swindled.
Exactly. He became intensely convinced, as his internal narrative saw it, that Hall, and crucially Hall's father, intended to seize the property. Not because Kiritsis had defaulted.
No.
But because its value had appreciated significantly. He believed they planned to flip the property for a huge profit, and in doing so, deliberately cut him out of the equity he felt he was entitled to.
And that alleged intent to profit at his expense is what fuels his desperation. I mean, he wasn't just defaulting on a worthless investment in his mind.
No, in his mind, he was being robbed of a potentially valuable asset.
And this belief was fueled, according to the sources that detail his later defense, by a conviction that Hall had actually claimed to have proof of this planned seizure and profit in writing.
Right. And whether or not that proof ever materialized, or if it only existed in Kiritsis' own mind, it doesn't really matter. The perception that he was being intentionally swindled created this intense, paranoid desperation that drove everything that happened next.
It turned a civil dispute into a perceived moral, almost existential battle.
Absolutely.
I think we need to spend a little more time here because that contrast between a simple financial failure and the subsequent calculated violence is just so jarring. What do the sources tell us about the property itself? Was this some major commercial holding or a small residential plot?
It was a residential property, but you have to understand, it was his financial lifeline. In the mid-70s, foreclosure was often devastating. and very public. For Kiritsis, a man who was later described as having this rigid adherence to order and propriety, the loss of his property, combined with the shame of debt and this belief that he was being maliciously exploited, it just created a pressure cooker.
We're not talking about a massive corporate deal.
No, not at all. We're talking about everything he had invested, everything he felt he had earned, being stripped away through what he saw as a deliberate, calculated betrayal by powerful people.
So this perceived betrayal, magnified by his psychological state, is what led directly to the morning of February 8th, 1977.
Mm-hmm.
Kiritsis didn't just go to Hall's office for a heated argument or to plead his case again. He went prepared for an act of total, meticulous, high-stakes control.
And we really have to analyze the mechanics of the crime itself, the extreme danger, the meticulous, really disturbing preparation that went into this custom device he constructed.
He arrived at Hall's office armed.
Very seriously armed.
Right.
With a 12-gauge Winchester 1400 sawed-off shotgun. I mean, this is a weapon designed for close-quarters lethality.
And the way he configured that shotgun is what elevates this case from a standard hostage scenario into something, well, into a moment of unique legal and psychological terror. It involved creating what became known around the world as the dead man's line.
The detail here is just crucial for understanding the tension of the next 63 hours. Kiritsis secured the muzzle of this sawed-off shotgun directly and tightly to the back of Richard Hall's head.
Just imagine that, the immediate psychological weight of that.
But the genius of the configuration, in a terrifying way, was the mechanism he designed for activation.
Walk us through that mechanism, because the complexity of it suggests such intense premeditation, which, clashes a bit with the later diagnosis of a psychotic break.
Precisely. A wire was connected from the trigger of the weapon. That wire then ran to a connection point on Hall's neck, right near his collar. The whole setup ensured a hair trigger activation based on multiple variables, not just Kiritsis's direct control.
So if you visualize this for a moment, you realize the truly ingenious and terrifying implied threat. This meant there were 3 potential ways the gun would fire and kill Hall instantly. And 2 of them were completely out of Hall's control, and 1 was even out of Kiritsis's.
The first and the most obvious threat was aimed at law enforcement, any rescuers. If a policeman shot Kiritsis or even tackled him, the resulting movement or just the natural tug of Kiritsis falling would pull that wire.
And the shotgun fire.
The shotgun fire is killing Hall. It was a perfect anti-sniper system.
The second threat was directed at Hall himself.
Right. If Hall tried to escape, if he struggled, his sudden movement could also put enough tension on the wire connected to his neck to trigger the weapon. Hall had to remain unnervingly still.
But the third factor, and this is maybe the most subtle and terrifying part, lay with Kiritsis.
Yes. The system was so tightly wired that any sudden emotional outburst or loss of physical control by Kiritsis himself, an involuntary spasm, a sudden drop of his hands, could also activate the line. It was essentially a mutually assured destruction device centered entirely on the hostage.
That level of meticulously planned, multi-layered threat, it moves so far beyond spontaneous anger. It's in a realm of carefully planned psychological warfare.
It was.
It was designed to paralyze everyone involved, Hall, the police, the negotiators, by making the consequence of any failure absolutely definitive.
And this is where you have to connect it back to his psychological state. It raises a really important question, especially when we consider his later psychiatric diagnosis. What level of mental desperation and meticulous cold preparation is required to construct such a precise and mutually destructive weapon?
It suggests a man who had fully committed.
Fully. Committed to an outcome where he either received his demands, no matter how outrageous they were, or he perished and took his perceived enemy with him. This preparedness is just critical context for understanding his behavior over the next 63 hours.
Indeed. And those first few minutes of the standoff really defined the next 63 hours. Kiritsis immediately called the police from Hall's office to announce what he had done.
He was controlling the narrative from the very beginning.
And the public's perception of the danger right from the start.
Right. And the duration of the standoff, which, again, was spent primarily in Kiritsis' own apartment, it created this vacuum of information, a silence in the heart of the crisis that he was very quick to fill with his own voice and his own narrative of victimhood and revenge.
And this is where the media element becomes not just important, but functionally integral to his entire strategy.
Oh, absolutely. His survival strategy.
The communication strategy was unique, and for his goals, highly effective. He didn't just speak through police negotiators, which was the standard practice.
No, he made frequent direct calls to the local radio station, WIBC 1070 AM, and he was specifically seeking out a newsman named Fred Heckman.
And Heckman made the crucial decision, a decision that was highly debated later, to broadcast what Kiritsis said.
He effectively gave Kiritsis a direct, uncensored line to the public, to the police, and ultimately to the people he was accusing of orchestrating this whole thing.
This instantaneous, personalized broadcasting gave Kiritsis immense, unprecedented leverage.
It did. It turned the police negotiation into a public relations battle, which in real time, he was winning.
Let's delve into Heckman's role for a second. Do the sources suggest he was just, reporting the facts? Or was he effectively facilitating the hostage-taker's demands by giving him the platform he needed? Feels like a major ethical gray area.
It was absolutely a gray area, and that's a big reason why this story persists. For Kiritsis, that platform was non-negotiable. He knew that as long as his voice was live and his perceived plight was public, the police would be much more cautious about trying any kind of violent intervention.
So Heckman becomes a central character.
He becomes a central, necessary character in the standoff. He was the conduit. The police negotiators suddenly had to deal with the demands Kiritsis was making to the entire listening audience, not just the ones he was making to them privately.
And his primary demand, beyond getting his property back, was centered on resolving his entire financial and legal situation. He wanted restitution, but also public vindication.
And the climax of that negotiation involved a lawyer facilitating the signing of a document by Hall. This was the moment where Kiritsis gained this temporary, paper-based control and validation of all his claims.
And the document itself was extraordinary in its scope.
It really was. It demonstrated the paranoia and the specific delusions driving him. It stated that Hall had mistreated Kiritsis, that he'd acted dishonestly, and perhaps most spectacularly, it stipulated that Hall would pay Kiritsis $5 million.
$5 million. It's such an arbitrary and massive number for a residential mortgage dispute in 1977.
It is.
It just underscores that this was never really just about the money he owed. It was about humiliation, power, and restitution for perceived grand conspiracy.
Precisely. And the truly staggering part of that document was the section dealing with what would happen after he surrendered. Kiritsis, through this document, tried to use the leverage of the dead man's line to grant himself total legal immunity.
So the document also said he wouldn't be prosecuted or even arrested.
That's what it stipulated, that he would not be prosecuted or even arrested once the standoff concluded.
I find that attempt at preemptive immunity just remarkable. I mean, did the lawyers or police have any intention of honoring that?
Legally, zero chance. They knew it was signed under duress, which would render it void in court. But tactically, in that moment, signing the document was the only way to facilitate Hall's release and de-escalate that immediate lethal threat.
The objective was just to get Hall away from the shotgun.
That's it. The legal ramifications of the signature were entirely secondary to the immediate preservation of life.
And the public spectacle reached its emotional peak right after Hall signed that document. Kiritsis demanded and he received a platform. He chose to make this lengthy, emotional speech, not privately to the police, but directly in front of live television cameras.
This was his moment of perceived triumph and vindication.
And he didn't hold back.
No, he did not. In front of the cameras, he publicly declared himself to be, and this is a quote, a goddamn national hero. He saw his actions not as a crime, but as a necessary, brave defense of his rights against a corrupt system, which he was now exposing.
But the immediate reaction from the media on the scene tells you everything about the tension of that moment. His speech became so volatile, his emotions so uncontrolled, that the journalists who were there actually started to worry that Kiritsis might lose control completely.
That he might shoot Hall right there.
On live national television.
And as a result of this immediate, intense fear, they made the extremely rare and controversial decision to terminate the live broadcast prematurely. They literally cut the feed to protect the victim, prioritizing safety over the scoop.
It just shows how quickly the energy in that room could shift from a speech of triumph to an act of homicide.
In a heartbeat.
And speaking of that high-stakes tension, there's a fascinating documented close call. A police plan for intervention is recounted vividly in the documentary Dead Man's Line by a WishHTV8 cameraman, Bill Fisher, who was right there.
The sources confirm this. Indianapolis Police Chief Gallagher had a specific, very high-risk mitigation plan ready to go. It was designed for an immediate, final, physical intervention if Kiritsis went too far or if negotiations broke down completely.
They couldn't rely on slow tactics. not with that wired shotgun.
Exactly.
And the signal for launching this plan was deceptively simple, but incredibly high stakes.
It was. If the chief pulled a handkerchief from his pocket, that was the signal for the operation to begin. The prearranged, silent cue for the assault team.
And the plan itself was rapid, brutal, and designed to be instantaneous, a coordinated, simultaneous attack.
The primary officer, and it was likely Gallagher himself, was to put a gun behind Kiritsis' ear and shoot him, while at the exact same time, another officer would physically jam the mechanism of the sawed-off shotgun to prevent the dead man's line from activating.
So they needed to stop the shotgun from firing in the milliseconds following Kiritsis' death.
Yes, a plan that speaks to the extreme difficulty of that situation. They needed a simultaneous kill and jam to save the hostage. That's a level of synchronization that is almost impossible to guarantee under stress.
And that's what makes Bill Fisher's recollection so powerful. He stated that Chief Gallagher, during the final fraught moments of Kiritsis' televised speech, reached into his pocket for that handkerchief not once, but 3 times.
3 times.
3 times the chief considered giving the order to initiate a kill shot, an order that would have instantly elevated the crisis into a violent, potentially catastrophic exchange.
But crucially, each time Gallagher ultimately pulled his hand back, he put the handkerchief back into his pocket.
And that hesitation, that self-restraint, was monumental.
It really was. It prevented the execution of a plan that carried immense risks, not only to Kiritsis, but potentially to Hall, depending on the instantaneous success of jamming that shotgun mechanism under pressure. It was restraint in the face of an absolute threat, and it probably saved Richard Hall's life.
The physical standoff finally concluded when Kiritsis released Hall. Just a collective moment of relief for everyone involved and everyone watching across the nation. But even in surrender, Kiritsis had one last, terrifying, theatrical move to make.
He needed to prove the validity of his actions. He had to justify the terror he had inflicted. So, to prove to the world that the threat had been absolutely real, Kiritsis immediately fired the shotgun into the air after Hall was released.
Proving it was loaded the whole time.
Proving unequivocally that the weapon had been loaded, that the wire had been active, and that Richard Hall had been seconds away from death for that entire 63-hour ordeal. He was instantly arrested right after that discharge, bringing the standoff to a definitive, if chaotic, end.
And now the narrative shifts dramatically, from the crime itself to the man who committed it. And this is where the difference between Kiritsis' publicly terrifying actions and his known character creates this real societal and legal puzzle.
It creates a tremendous human and legal paradox that the jury had to grapple with later on. The sources indicate that most people who knew Kiritsis, his neighbors, his acquaintances, they had surprisingly positive things to say about him.
They expressed deep shock.
Deep shock and disbelief at his actions.
He wasn't some known neighborhood troublemaker or a volatile criminal just waiting for a trigger. Instead, he was described consistently as always helpful and kind to his neighbors.
Also a hard worker.
And, perhaps most ironically, considering the law he violated, a strict law and order sort of man, someone who believed in following rules and respecting authority.
And this portrait of a generally upstanding, even rigid citizen stands in stark opposition to the calculated, terrifying, and completely lawless crime he committed.
It suggests a profound break from reality.
A temporary but intense psychological fracture driven by that perceived financial injustice.
And even Kiritsis' own statements during and immediately after the event reinforced this paradox, this conflicted man. He repeatedly stated to Heckman and to the police that he did not actually want anyone hurt.
Right. He showed moments of what seemed like emotional remorse. He even offered a public apology for how he had treated Dick Hall.
Which suggests a deep disconnect between the man's fundamental moral compass, the part that valued order and kindness, and the specific actions driven by his desperate delusional state.
And the only way to really reconcile those two identities is through the lens of psychological distress.
That deep disconnect is exactly what formed the core of his legal defense. Let's focus now on that defense and the mental health diagnosis that led to the verdict, because this is where the Kiritsis case becomes so historically significant and so controversial.
The trial outcome was, and it remains, highly controversial. Kiritsis was ultimately found not guilty by reason of insanity.
And that's not a simple statement. It opens up this massive discussion about how the law even defines culpability.
It does.
This verdict wasn't based on simple claims of distress or, a momentary passion. The defense relied heavily on professional clinical assessment. What exactly did the psychiatrists find?
The core of the defense was clinical. Psychiatrists testified extensively that Kiritsis was actively psychotic and operating in a sustained paranoid delusional state throughout the entirety of the 63-hour incident.
And it's crucial to understand what that means in a legal context.
It is. A paranoid delusional state means he was genuinely incapable of distinguishing the difference between right and wrong as defined by law because his reality was distorted by these unshakable false beliefs.
Specifically, the belief that Hall and his father were engaged in this malevolent grand scheme to rob him.
Exactly. So his actions, however violent and calculated they were legally considered the product of his illness, not the product of a sane criminal mind seeking personal gain. That diagnosis provided the necessary legal footing for the insanity defense to succeed under the laws of Indiana at that specific time.
And the defense argued that because the delusion centered so intensely on the property, the belief he was being cheated out of valuable equity, the crime itself was a direct manifestation of the psychosis.
That's right. He wasn't kidnapping for money in a traditional sense. He was kidnapping to defend against a perceived profound injustice that only existed in his distorted reality.
So what happened to him after the acquittal? Being found not guilty by reason of insanity isn't the same as being found innocent and set free.
Absolutely not. Following the acquittal, he was committed to a maximum security mental institution, and the sources follow his life post-trial pretty extensively. He remained confined for nearly 11 years until January 1988.
What facilitated his release after such a controversial crime?
Well, the legal hurdle for his continued confinement just became insurmountable for the state. They could no longer legally prove that he was still a danger to society.
Right. Mental health laws require regular review.
Exactly. And once the specific delusional state that drove the crime was medically judged to be stabilized or resolved, the state had no legal basis to continue holding him indefinitely, despite the severity of the original crime.
And we know his final years were spent back in the community. He died of natural causes at his home in January 2005. He was 72. It was a quiet, almost anticlimactic end to a life that had been defined by that one explosive 63-hour period in 1977.
That quiet ending, however, it really belies the immense, loud, and immediate consequences this case had on American law. The shockwaves from that verdict were felt instantly.
And this brings us to the lasting consequences. This is where you, the listener, can really see the structural impact of a single high-profile case. Kiritsis' trial triggered a national legal shift, specifically concerning the burden of proof in insanity defenses. That is a truly foundational concept in criminal law.
You have to understand the pre-existing Indiana law to truly appreciate the scale of the change. At the time of the Kiritsis trial, Indiana law and the law in several other states placed the enormous burden of proof for insanity claims squarely on the prosecution.
Let's elaborate on that crucial detail, because for anyone who isn't familiar with jurisprudence, it sounds completely counterintuitive.
It does. Under that old rule, the defendant was basically presumed insane unless the prosecution could prove otherwise. That meant the prosecution had the extremely difficult, maybe impossible task of having to prove the defendant was sane beyond a reasonable doubt.
So the defense just had to plant a little bit of doubt.
A little bit of reasonable doubt about sanity, relying heavily on the testimony of sympathetic psychiatrists to secure the acquittal. It was a massive advantage for the defense in cases that involved deep psychological complexity.
But the Kiritsis verdict, this notorious hostage taker, acquitted and then hospitalized, was too much for the public consciousness and the legislature to bear.
The sources are very clear on this, directly because of the Kiritsis trial, and specifically citing the testimony and strategy of the chief defense psychiatrist, Larry M. Davis, combined with the later, equally controversial, trial of John Hinckley Jr.
The man who attempted to assassinate President Ronald Reagan.
That's the one. Indiana and other states moved immediately and substantially to revise their laws.
In the Hinckley case, just 4 years later in 1981, it provided that final political momentum. You had two high-profile, violent offenders successfully use the old standard to avoid a criminal conviction, and that forced legislators to act.
And this shift wasn't minor, it was structural. It reversed centuries of legal tradition.
The new standard completely reversed the old requirement.
Completely. After the reforms, the burden of proof for an insanity plea was shifted squarely onto the shoulders of the defense. If the defense wants to claim insanity, they now have to prove it.
Using a preponderance of evidence, or sometimes even beyond a reasonable doubt.
That the defendant was legally insane at the time of the offense, the state no longer has to prove sanity.
So help us connect that change to the bigger picture for the listener. Why does that matter today?
It matters profoundly because this case serves as a powerful illustration of how high-profile, emotionally charged criminal cases can serve as immediate catalysts for deep structural changes in jurisprudence. Legal systems often react slowly, guided by precedent.
But public outrage.
Public outrage and the perceived failure of justice in cases involving extreme violence, like Kiritsis and Hinckley, can force swift legislative action. This change made it significantly harder for future defendants to successfully use the insanity defense. It's a direct legacy.
And beyond the legal changes, the 63 hours Kiritsis spent in the spotlight generated this massive ongoing media legacy, mostly due to the fact that it was one of the first truly televised high-stakes standoffs where the hostage-taker controlled the narrative through direct live broadcasting.
And the visual component of it was immediately captured and recognized globally. John H. Blair, a freelance photographer working for UPI, was at the scene, and he captured the visual essence of the standoff. He won the 1978 Pulitzer Prize for spot news photography for a specific, indelible image taken during the incident.
And that photograph, the one showing Hall with the shotgun barrel pressed against his head, it became the visual shorthand for the entire ordeal. It cemented its place in news history.
And the event didn't just appear in news coverage, it became a kind of shorthand for a broader societal commentary on violence in the United States during that era.
Right, footage of the Kiritsis incident was included in the influential 1982 documentary, The Killing of America.
Yes, and that documentary cited Kiritsis specifically as one of many shocking examples illustrating the pervasive and increasing violence within the nation in the 1970s. It was seen as evidence of a societal breakdown, where a civil dispute could devolve into a televised siege.
The fact that they used the footage shows how quickly Kiritsis became this kind of archetype of the unstable American criminal.
He did. And the cultural fascination with this story hasn't waned. It's simply evolved from immediate news coverage to historical documentation, and now to serious dramatic adaptation. It confirms its enduring, almost mythic place in the public consciousness.
We see this enduring interest in the list of adaptations, spanning multiple platforms.
We do. First, nearly 4 decades later, a feature-length documentary about the incident, titled Dead Man's Line, was released in 2018. This showed a sustained, serious historical interest in revisiting the archival material and interviewing those who were involved.
Then, building on that research and archival footage, a major audio dramatization emerged. American Hostage, an 8-episode podcast dramatization starring John Hamm, was released in 2022.
And that signals the transition of this historical event into modern narrative storytelling platforms. It's appealing to a contemporary audience through high-quality audio fiction.
And the fascination continues to move into major cinematic adaptation, which indicates Hollywood's recognition of the dramatic potential.
Exactly. The sources mention Dead Man's Wire, an upcoming film adaptation directed by the acclaimed Gus Van Sant and starring major actors like Bill Skarsgård and Dacre Montgomery.
And the very title, Dead Man's Wire, confirms that the terrifying mechanism Kiritsis invented remains the central defining image of the entire story.
It does.
So, the final synthesis for you, the listener, is clear. The Kiritsis case is not just a historical crime that resulted in a controversial acquittal and legal reform. It's a continuing, evolving subject of analysis and dramatization across multiple media platforms: film, documentary, scripted audio, proving the powerful and often disruptive impact that televised high-stakes standoffs have,
both on the public consciousness and ultimately on our legal imagination. The story persists because it touches upon fundamental issues of fairness, justice, the definition of sanity under extreme duress, and, of course, the ethical role of the media.
We've covered a tremendous amount of ground today, charting the financial motive that was rooted in that perceived betrayal, the shocking, calculated details of the Dead Man's Line weapon,
the chaotic, real-time media coverage that gave Kiritsis his platform, and the ultimate legal acquittal that directly led to reversing legal precedent nationwide regarding the burden of proofs in criminal trials.
It's a case where the criminal act itself was really only the beginning of the story. The fallout continues to shape how we view the intersection of mental illness, financial distress, and criminal accountability.
As a final thought that builds on the material we've explored, consider this. Guaranteed media access was something Kiritsis specifically demanded. It became not just a preference, but an integral component of his strategy for survival and public validation. It even influenced the terms of his surrender, including that impossible demand for temporary immunity.
So the media itself became a tool.
The incident shows the immediate, volatile power of the media platform when leveraged by an individual in a paranoid, delusional state to achieve what was ultimately temporary influence and attention. The platform itself became a tool of coercion.
A powerful thought to consider. Thank you for joining us for this extensive analysis of the Anthony Kiritsis standoff and its lasting aftermath.
It was our pleasure.
Thanks for listening.